Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Hey, welcome today to the Leadership Forum. I want to introduce a son of a good friend of mine who, and I've known his son for a long time, a lot longer than I cared to realize when we talked, and 20 years, so at least 20 years. And today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jeff Brazell. And Jeff is the founder and the CEO of a company called the Modelers, LLC. And on the flyer that we made out, based on his, I'm going to read this a little bit for you, and maybe you've seen that flyer. But Dr. Brazell has a genuine passion for high-end market research, blended with a rich and diversified background in management, academic training, and applied expertise. Over the past 20 years, he has held various high-level management positions at several national and international firms and has taught marketing at 2 universities and has been extensively involved in researching new quantitative methods. If I remember right, one is overseas and the other one is Michigan. Is that right?
Universities?
Yeah.
Now, I've
Michigan?
taught a little bit, taught a term up at the University of Utah and then 5 years at the University of Sydney.
Okay, but I saw Michigan on there, that lectured at Michigan. Is that right?
I do some, from time to time, I do some guest lecturing at places like Ohio State, which is very close to Michigan, but they don't like each other very much, really. So.
That I know.
Spent a little time at Michigan, but I've never taught there.
Oh, okay. So it was Ohio State that you lectured. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Good. He says over the past, let's see, he is co-author of numerous academic articles published in the top marketing and management journals, along with chapters in books and a new textbook. 7 Summits of Marketing Research with Greg Allenby at Ohio State. He has been blissfully married for nearly 30 years and has 3 amazing children. And the modelers and clients include Boeing, P&G, GM, EA Sports, LG, Verizon, Adobe, Disney, Hilton, Levi's, Pepsi, Toyota, Coke, Warner Brothers, AMEX, FedEx, the NFL, the U.S. Department of Defense, Pixar, Sony, and others. Do you recognize those names? Okay. Well, okay, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Jeff Brazell.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of your busy day to attend today. You know, one of the biggest challenges facing every brand today is keeping or growing their market share in an environment of global hyper-competition and really tough financial times. Markets are moving at a blinding pace. Competitors are attacking from every direction. Plus, consumers have access to competitive information in their pockets. It's not enough, really, for brands to know what consumers wanted yesterday. They need to know what consumers want now, and even more important, they need to know what people want tomorrow. So that's what we do. That's what our company does. Most companies don't have the answers that they need to make better decisions. And so most Fortune 500s at least do a lot of marketing research. And the Modelers is a company that helps those people do that market research and learn about their consumers, learn about how people make decisions and why people make decisions. And we help them to make better products, to price those products correctly, to come up with the best messages. So better market research through predictive modeling and advanced analytics are all about helping our clients get better answers, and those answers are used so that they can win. So how did I end up in a career like this? Well, when I was a teenager, I started my first company, a little software development company, and I was programming on a TRS-80 from Radio Shack, and oh, the power of 64K of RAM, 24 by 40 screen resolution, and it came with a real floppy drive, you know, one of those old 5 1/4 inch. Then I enrolled at the university, took some generals, trying to decide what I wanted to do. Went on a religious mission to Argentina, came back to Salt Lake, and really, while I was going to the university, I kind of became a serial entrepreneur. I started taking some business classes because it really helped me figure out, you know, in these businesses I was starting, how to actually do something. I had a small import-export business with my dad. We went on and bought a small manufacturing company, which we sold a few years later. We did some service businesses. And what I found all the time is I kept getting bored very quickly. We'd do a business for a little while. I'd get bored. I really felt like I needed to know more. And so a little bit later in life, I decided to go back and get a PhD. I managed to get a job teaching at the University of Sydney in Sydney, Australia, and that allowed me to work with one of the people who's the best in the world at consumer decision-making modeling. His name's Jordan Louviere. That's the reason I went over to Australia, is to work under him. And I worked on a PhD and taught at the University of Sydney for years. For anybody who's ever considered doing a PhD, it's hard. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. So when I finished my PhD, I was sitting there talking to some others and said, wow, some of the things that we're able to do in predictive models, using statistics to really understand how people trade off price against other features of products, you know, how it all comes together in their minds, and then being able to mathematically model that so we can put it into a computer, run a lot of different scenarios, and really help people optimize their offerings. Well, this is really cool stuff, and it's not being done very well out in the marketplace. So let's start a company. And we started doing some consulting while I was still in Australia. And then a few years later, I came back to the United States. We established the Modelers with a headquarters here in Salt Lake City. We also have a Boston office with 7 people in the Boston office. And then we have consumer, kind of the face of the company in various major cities around the United States. In 2010, we were purchased by the Omnicom Group. The Omnicom Group is a $12.5 billion global marketing and corporate communications company. They own a lot of the really big advertising agencies, but really they have they're a group of over 200 companies, and they're publicly traded. So as Rick was mentioning, we work with a lot of the Fortune 500 companies out there. These are companies that have big brands, that have billions of dollars in sales, and they've also learned the power of doing research and not making decisions just based on gut feel. So we work with companies in CPG like P&G and SC Johnson. We work in technology with companies like Microsoft and Intel and Symantec and other software companies. We work in entertainment. We do work for Disney and for Warner Brothers and for New Line Cinemas and for most of the major entertainment companies. Entertainment company called the NFL. We also do work in fashion with Levi's and Gap, and we've worked with Walmart and other retailers. So and we also do a lot of pharmaceutical work. We worked with Johnson & Johnson and other pharmaceutical companies. So we have a lot of broad experience across a lot of different industries. And something I absolutely love about that is the fact that, again, in some of my earlier career, I'd kind of get bored all the time. And being able to be thinking about how to help a company like Microsoft at the same time I'm thinking about helping a company like Philips and maybe a company like Frito-Lay. They have similar challenges, but there are a lot of nuances in each one of them, and so it's really exciting. Also, some more clients there: Wells Fargo, Universal, USAA, Visa, Marriott, Delta, a lot of different ones. So one thing we learned really early on is all this complex statistical stuff. To make it accessible to business decision makers, we had to put it into computer simulations. And so we hired a group of computer programmers, really smart guys, and we started putting together what we called interactive decision tools. So we'd take these complex statistical models and build them into these tools where we could just use drop-down boxes and try a lot of different scenarios. I'm going to give you a few examples of how that works as I go along. So in the real world, everything is complex. Really simplistic models of how people make decisions and how they trade things off don't work very well most of the time. You have to get a little complexity in there to capture enough of the nuances so that you really can accurately predict what people are going to do, what people are going to buy, and so there's some there are a lot of nuances there, and everybody's probably, I don't know if you've seen this. This is off of a geometry test at some point. Probably wasn't here at Slick. But, find X. Here it is, right? The simplest solutions are often the cleverest. They are also often wrong. So the idea is capture, our goal is always capture enough of the complexity to get the answers as accurate as possible, but don't get so lost in complexity that you're doing needlessly difficult things. But the kinds of statistical approaches that we use all the time have some big scary names. We use primarily Bayesian approaches that have become more popular over the last decade. We have hierarchy of effects, cross-sectional models. We use discrete choice models. We do a lot of discrete choice modeling. In our marketing mix models, we're now using vector autoregression models or VAR-X models. We use various kinds, that's a type of time series model. We use generalized Bayes model. You name it, all of these statistical models end up having pretty complex names. You kind of need a master's degree, at least in that area, to kind of figure them out. But I'm going to jump into some examples because it's a lot more fun to talk about examples. And this one has been disguised. We've done work before for the NFL for a couple of teams. And I'm going to talk about a team that we did not do any work for, the New England Patriots. So say the company is an NFL team, and every year they do a draft, and they want to draft good players and not bad players. They want to use their early draft picks to draft really good players who are going to be superstars. As it turns out, how often do you think the guys in the first round all end up being superstars? How good is the NFL at doing this? So, a few years ago, when we were really working hard on this a few years ago, the starters in the Pro Bowl, none of the starters at quarterback, running back, or receiver or tight end were taken in the first round. None of them. As a matter of fact, some of them were undrafted free agents. When you think about true, real superstar quarterbacks, for every first-round quarterback, there's a Tom Brady. Anybody know where Tom Brady was taken? Sixth round. In other words, they made a big mistake. They didn't realize that he'd be any good. So, as it turns out, in spite of the fact that the NFL spends millions of dollars per team every year in scouting and paying very expensive people to make these decisions, basically, if you do a statistical analysis of how accurate they are, they do a little bit better than putting the names in a hat and just pulling them out, but that's about it. There are no teams that do extremely well. So if we're trying to solve that problem, say a company comes to us and says, well, we got to solve that problem. Well, how do we approach that? Well, our company looks at it and says, okay, well, what do we already know? And this is pretty much for all of it doesn't matter if it's the NFL or some other company, whether it's a product or a service. What do we already know? Then let's build a conceptual model, and then let's build a statistical model that'll capture what we want. So, again, draft accuracy for NFL teams is actually pretty abysmal. And when you talk to people who do that for a living, they almost always go, I'm the guy that found Tom Brady. You say, well, in other words, you got lucky. You took a guy in the 6th round that if you had known he was going to be any good, he would have been taken in the 1st round. And so, whenever somebody says, hey, I'm the guy that found so-and-so and drafted him in the 5th or 6th or 7th round, that means that they just got lucky, and they really hang on that. So they don't do very well at it. So it doesn't matter. That's another part of this as we looked at it and looked at some models and said, okay, if we plot on here all the teams' winning percentages over a 10-year period and the average draft accuracy taken as can you justify that you took a guy in the 1st round after he's been around for 5 years? There's this relationship that shows pretty clearly, yeah, there's a relationship. But there's other stuff going on besides your draft, right? So, for example, think of a team up here. So their average draft accuracy, well, somebody here, their average draft accuracy is actually pretty low. Their winning percentage is low, but the accuracy is higher than it should be. These guys that get way off the line, usually those end up being teams like, say, New England that are no better than the rest of the teams in their draft accuracy, but they tend to win a lot, right? And so there are other things that happen. Maybe coaching, Belichick's pretty good, scheduling, and very frankly, luck. Somebody slips on that critical down and they lose or they win based on just one little thing. So really quickly, let's just build a conceptual model of how are we going to predict the performance of draft picks in the NFL for quarterbacks. What variables would you expect to be looking at? Just anybody. What would you look at if you had to choose a quarterback? What do you want to know?
Arm strength.
Arm strength.
Accuracy.
Speed. Accuracy. Can he scramble? Okay.
Processing as well.
Okay. So
now they're looking at, can he run out the pocket? Will he get out the pocket and run?
exactly.
It's starting to come up. So
Escapability. Can he throw out of the pocket? There are a lot of variables, right? So these are all the kind of variables that we use in our models. And so let's divide those into a couple of different areas. So a bunch of college stats, well, we can get those pretty easily, right? We can know number of completions, number of attempts, percentage of completions, rushing yards, all those kind of things. Number 2, leadership, poise, judgment, control over emotions, these personal traits, right? And then personal skills, most of those things that you just mentioned fall under here. Ability to time pass, accuracy of the long ball, accuracy of the short ball, escapability, those ability to scramble, those kind of things fall in there. So unfortunately, I don't have I was going to ask you all to vote and say which ones of these are really going to work. I couldn't get my internet access going here. So instead, I'm just going to ask you. So how many people think that these kind of stats are really going to help us make the decision? A little bit, okay. How about personal traits? Leadership, poise, judgment. Those things important? Okay. How about the personal skills? All right. Most people aren't voting here, so all right. So as it turns out, these kinds of things don't help you very much. They're very much dependent on the rest of your team and the league you play in. I mean, if you play in a pass-wacky league, you may run up these gigantic stats, but you may not have the skills to get into the NFL. These kind of things help a lot, And these kind of things also have an impact. I mean, your height and your arm strength and all those kind of things. And it turns out that people that can control their emotions really well and still play well in the fourth quarter, where other people kind of burn out by then, makes a big difference. So now we have a little bit, we know what data we can go out and find. Well, now how about a conceptual model of, well, how are we going to bring these things together? Well, it turns out that there's something in human performance called performance theory that talks about, you know, there are various performance resource dimensions that we can bring together in some kind of a model that shows how those things interact and how they predict whether somebody's going to be any good. And so it turns out that physical, how fast does he run down the field? Tactical, does he go to the right place given a certain set and where the other players are? You know, technical, can he actually catch the ball when it hits his hands? Concentration, you know, can he do that, especially in the fourth quarter? Emotional, is he a leader? Does he help other people around him do better? You have to pull all those things together. Yep.
How about left hand versus right hand?
Left hand versus right hand is, you know, mostly those kind of things fall into this physical. Left-handed versus right-handed, and very frankly, they look at everything. The length of, from the tip of your finger down to your elbow, I mean, all those kinds of things will make a difference and can impact somebody's skill. So the first kind of statistical model that most people think about is a regression, okay? And a regression is something that anybody can do in Excel, really easy to do. It takes a whole bunch of points, and it runs a line down through the middle. And basically the idea behind a regression, very useful model by the way, usually, is that if all you know is a data point, you can guess what the other data point is going to be, right? So basically this line is saying that if I know that something is a 0.6, my best guess on what the other point is a 2, right? So people were using regression models and are still using regression models in human performance, and they don't work at all. They're horrible. Why? If this were a super advanced statistics class, I'd ask you, why is that? Let's see if anybody can pick up on the intuition, what it is. So a regression model finds the average performance across people who have succeeded versus haven't succeeded, and et cetera. The average physical traits and the average emotion. Why is that no good?
Well, it definitely just doesn't. There's too much of an extreme for the people that do too poorly and too well. That even just saying the average, there's too much of an outlier for them for a regression model to be completely accurate.
Okay, so as it turns out, one of the words you used is exactly right, which is that people who succeed in almost anything, but especially in professional sports, it turns out that they're outliers in something. In other words, they put together, you know, the one guy may have be a little bit faster and be a little bit taller and have a little bit better reach, and that's how he gets past everybody to catch a ball. And another guy may be just incredibly precise in the way he runs his routes, and so that's how he gets open. And so when you use all these averages and et cetera, you also, decision makers get this thing in their head saying, you know, the best tight end in the NFL needs to be at least 6'6", and he's going to be this and this and this and this. And no one's ever going to pick Steve Largent, for example, who turned out to be the best, or at least the tight end that caught more balls than anybody in history. How did he do it? He ran a more precise route than other people than the defense could cover. So the idea is, as it turned out, this kind of a statistical model didn't work at all. The idea was, let's pick up on these outlying things that are really important, and then you have to have a certain threshold in everything else. You know, even if you can run really precise routes, if you don't meet certain thresholds, you're still not going to be able to succeed. So what we did is we put together a team of PhDs, Bayesian statistical methods, econometrics, forecasting, biomechanics, physiology, sports psychology, built this model, which was this ridiculous, Bayesian mixture fusion technology with dynamic weighting, adaptive optimization, blah, blah, blah. And all that gobbledygook means is we had to develop a different threshold model that could pick up the really high on something and good enough on other things that really would determine whether somebody was actually going to do well. So we went back and reanalyzed a bunch of data to see if decision makers had been using these models instead of just what they were doing, would they have been better off? And it turns out that they would have about doubled the accuracy with which they were choosing players. So would that be a big deal to a team? You'd think that'd be a big deal to a team, right? So, whoops. I guess so as it turns out, before I go to my next example, as it turns out, sometimes it's hard to get these kinds of things adopted. One time I was standing in the headquarters of an NFL team the week before the draft, and the GM came in and said, I've got 3 receivers that were running through drills today down on the practice field. What's the one thing I need to look at? And I looked at him and said, if it was only one thing you needed to look at, you could, everybody would know what that one thing was, right? It would be so obvious to everyone. These kind of models showed that you could put together all kinds of different combinations to become really successful. But one thing the models also did really well is identify people who were not going to be successful. And that would be really helpful to teams. We worked with a couple of teams on this, and then we were finding that politically it was very difficult for us to succeed with these teams because we'd come in, and it was a little bit like anybody who saw Moneyball or read Moneyball. You go in and start telling people that, hey, the statistician says that this guy is not going to make it, and the guy that is getting paid to make that decision says, hey, I see this guy, he's faster than his 40, he's got great footwork, I really think this guy can play. And they'd ignore what we said and do what they wanted to do anyway. And so after a while we found that we were not having success with these teams because they were just kind of ignoring us. After a couple of years, by the way, going back and looking at our evaluations, the statistical models still were the best way of making this decision. So now I'm going to run through a few other examples just very quickly. The kinds of questions that we answer. Disney spends a lot of dollars on deploying characters in their parks. Wandering around, in shows, in parades, going to a specific location where people can line up and get an autograph. They want to maximize visitor satisfaction while minimizing the cost. So they need to know, well, which character should we be deploying? Is there a reason to deploy Tweedledee and Tweedledum in Fantasyland? Or should we, if we're going to spend the money, should we put somebody else out there? What's the relationship with park load? In other words, if there are a lot more people in the park, should we be having a lot more characters or less? Or, what is it, how do we optimize this? And so, that would be a study that we would design. And we'd actually, in that case, we worked with Disney on how to get at that answer, and then we built a simulation so they could, any given month, they could say, okay, we expect the park load to be like this month. What are the best characters to deploy? How should we deploy them to maximize our, how happy people are at the parks? A big CPG company was looking at going into 5 different emerging economy kinds of countries. And in order to make it work financially, they needed to come up with one product that would work across all 5 of these countries, and they had to go out with the same messaging. And so what they wanted to do is optimize before they actually came up with a product. Optimize what product they would come up with, what would the size of the package be, what would they charge, what would the message be to people. Another client wanted to know, well, you know what? Right now we're only selling our our clothing in specialty stores and in malls and relatively expensive kinds of places. Well, what happens if we start selling our brand in Walmart and in online discounter kinds of places? What would happen to our, number one is what happens to our short-term sales. Number two is what happens to our long-term sales. What happens to our brand? Does that affect our brand? Do all of our people, do the specialty stores in the malls suddenly discontinue carrying our brand? How about brand positioning? After some basic research, some strong input from creatives. So this is on what does your brand mean out there in the marketplace. The creatives and others said, you know what? Our brand isn't perceived in the marketplace as being very sexy, and it's not being perceived as very fun. And it looks like those are the areas where if people believed we were more sexy or more fun, it would be better for our brand. So at some companies, maybe the way that this decision would be made is they'd gather all the decision makers together. They'd say, okay, well, some people say we should make our brand more sexy, and that's what we should go to the marketplace with. And others think that it should be more fun, and that's what we're going to go to the marketplace with. And then somebody would finally make the decision, right? Well, if you have these statistical models and you have this ability to simulate these things, you can make that decision a little bit more using more exact information. So, can we get it down to financial impact? Can we say, what impact is this going to have on sales, revenues, profits? And it turns out that the answer to that is yes. For the vast majority of the projects we do, we can boil those kinds of decisions down into financial impact. So this is an example of a simulator, computerized simulator, that we provide to our clients. It's been disguised a little bit, but you can get the gist of it. These variables right here are being collected in what's called a brand tracker. Most big companies survey a lot of people every month, and they ask about all the brands in their category. So if you're in technology, you might be asking about say you're in an antivirus company, you're going to be asking about all of the competitors there, Symantec, Norton, and Microtrans and others, and you're going to say, well, think about Symantec. How does it rate? And then you're going to ask all these questions about each one of the brands. Well, they have a belief that these are the variables that are driving the value of their brand. So, as you can see here, for this fashion company, they look and fit great when they first start, but they don't stand out. They're not very fun. They're not very sexy. They're less expensive, and et cetera. Okay, so that's kind of where they are. And what we can do now is, since we have this simulation with this model that tells us what will happen if we change something, we can change fun. And so what we do is we say, okay, we'll move fun from where it was up to a 6.7. What if our brand were perceived in the marketplace as being really fun? What would happen? Well, we run it through the model, and it tells us that for this is for total US. For the total US, we're going to increase our revenues by $36 million. Well, that's a pretty good result. That's pretty fun, I think. So what about sexy? Well, we just put fun back to where it is, and we say, well, what if we really concentrate on sexy, and we try to become a much more sexy brand? Well, we'll put that up at 6.7. We'll see what happens, and it turns out we're better off by $5.4 million. Well, now what happens in that discussion of fun versus sexy, where decision makers are sitting around, and they say, well, look, if we can really move the meter on fun, we're going to pick up $36 million in revenue. On the other hand, if we can move the needle on sexy, 5.5. And that is not to say that that's going to be the decision they make. They may look at it and say, you know what, our chances, it doesn't matter how much money we spend, we can't convince people that we're fun, because we're just not a very fun brand, right? So they may or may not be able to do that. But at least the decision makers now have this kind of data where they sit down and say, look, $36 million versus $5 million. This is the upside. Now let's decide what to do. Makes a big difference. My obligatory Star Wars clip. Sometimes I'm amazed at with all the complexity and all the data that are out there, with all of the challenges in bringing this all together, the fact that it's working really actually amazes me. For client after client, for year after year, we find that the vast majority of these models are very accurate in predicting what people are going to do, what the optimum products are, what the optimum messages are. And if we listen, if decision makers will pay attention to those models, it helps it helps them win in the marketplace. So, just talking for a couple of minutes about the jobs in this kind of a company. The jobs are good paying jobs. We get entry-level project managers, for example, need to have a bachelor's degree normally, and they're going to start off between $40,000 and $50,000 a year, and then as they get more and more experience, they go up from there. An entry-level analyst, we don't have anybody with anything less than a master's degree. A master's or a PhD in statistics, econometrics, biostatistics, something like that is kind of required for this kind of a job. Now those people with those advanced degrees end up starting off at more money. They start somewhere between $55,000 and $75,000, depending upon again how much experience they've run up while they were working on their degree and et cetera. And then all of these jobs go up to $80,000, $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 a year. So good groceries almost anywhere you live. Great paying jobs, and so now frankly one of the challenges in our company is the fact that people get paid. Since people get paid a lot of money, that means we have to charge a lot of money, and we have to provide that kind of value for clients so that they look at that and say, hey, I'm really getting the value for the money. So that's just an overview of kind of what we do and some examples, and I'd be happy to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes taking some questions. Drink from a fire hose, sorry about that. Yes?
How do you rate, when you were rating it, how do you do that?
So how do you rate things? So in more sophisticated models, so in discrete choice models, for example, what we would have is we would have a survey where we put together hypothetical situations where you walk into a store and you say, here's the shelf. Here are the products that are there. Here are the prices. What are you going to buy? So that's that kind of most of our studies use a more sophisticated kind of a task like that one. What we try to do is mimic the way people really make decisions. Now on the other hand, on those, there were some of those things that are a rating task. So a rating task is one of these exercises that all of us have gone through probably at some point where they ask you, on a scale of 1 to 7, how well does this, how sexy is this brand? On a scale of 1 to 7, how sexy is that brand? How, and et cetera. And so there will be rating scales for some things. For others, we just have a choice that people make, and it just depends on the kind of model you're trying to build and what makes most sense for asking questions. The industry actually in general, the market research industry, the smartest companies have moved away from a lot of those rating scales. I mean, the problem with rating scales is we as human beings, I mean, we don't walk into a store and stand in front of the shelf and say, well, I don't know, on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, that's probably a 6.2, that one's about a 5.8, that one's a, I mean, we do all that stuff in our brain automatically. We stand in front of a shelf, we've got 100 different possibilities. We walk in, we go, thoink, and we take it. And we as human beings are just, are decision-making machines. We're incredibly good at it. And all those trade-offs are made in our minds, you know. And we go to buy a car, and we want to buy I really want leather seats and a sunroof. And then we notice that all the cars with leather seats and a sunroof cost $1,500 more. And we go, yeah, you know, I kind of like a hard top. It's a lot safer in a rollover, you know. But we're able to make those kind of trade-offs pretty well too. Yep, over here.
I was just thinking back on your sports with the idea of injuries that are taking more and more attention now, concussions and all that kind of stuff. Do you factor any of that in, or is that just part of being strong? Or how many hits did this guy take? How many injuries did he have? Where were the injuries and that sort of thing?
Yeah, injury history is one of the things that will go into the physical part of the model. It's actually shocking how little data a lot of these teams gather on a very systematic way. We met with the Jazz once upon a time. You can do this with lots of different sports. And actually, you have some very, very smart people down at the Utah Jazz as far as, you know, they go out to look at a player, and they will look at a very systematic list of things. And that's a good place to start if you're going to use data to make decisions. Getting the same data over and over again is really important, you know. And in football all the time, we'd see these reports from scouts where, you know, they'd talk about one player and say, oh, he's got great footwork and this, that, and the other thing. And then on the next sheet of paper, you'd get no mention of footwork at all. And so, you know, part of it is getting all those things. And in today's internet savvy, internet generation, there's so much data available usually. I mean, you're drowning in the data. Yep.
I know you just changed course for a minute. I know you said you mentioned your PhD being one of the most hardest things you ever had to accomplish. Can you explain briefly why it's so hard?
Sure. So right now you're in school. You take a class, you study for a test, and you know the day after you spit it out on the test and get your grade, you can forget it to some extent, right? I mean, I don't. Is this a revelation to you? I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I'm breaking anybody's bubble here. But school is a game to get some grades, and your undergrad, and to some extent a master's degree as well, is about getting grades and kind of proving that you can think, proving that you learned something, right? Well, it turns out that a PhD isn't that. By the end of your PhD, you have to prove to a committee, and usually some other people as well, that you know more about a certain area than anybody else in the world. You have become the world expert in something. And so you can't get away with studying and forgetting something anymore. Now somebody says, now the test is a verbal test where they say, oh, okay, well, you say this. Well, why do you think that? And you've got to be able to say, well, the research has been done on that. There's a paper in the 1998 JMR that says this, and then there was this 2004 paper by so-and-so and so-and-so that said this, and this paper, and those things taken together would suggest this, but I also think, and you have to really just know things at a level that you never had to do before in school. And that makes it a totally new game. I mean, it's not about getting grades anymore. It's about knowing something deeply. Yep.
So you had your PhD in Sydney.
Yes.
So I have a question because I know that, like, you know, if you go and have another degree, like in other countries, when you come to America, like it doesn't count as. I mean, did you have that problem?
No. And again, it depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you get a medical degree in a different country, it may or not be recognized here. A PhD, it depends on the area, but also everybody here knew that my PhD advisor was this guy who's one of the best in the world, and he always teaches he teaches a summer course at MIT, and everybody knows him. And so at the end of the day, they also really weigh heavily those kinds of things. Good question. Yep.
So, like, with your clients, when you use these models, do you have to collect your own data sometimes, or do you rely and entirely on data that they bring to you?
So our company, about half the time, we gather all the, we end up having to gather the data. We look at a problem, we say, okay, you don't have the data you need to understand this. An awful lot of the time that's because, by the way, in spite of the fact that we have the big data revolution where we're drowning in data out there. Yeah, we have user reviews on Amazon and on every other site. We have click data on every site. We have Google Trends. We have Google Search. We have, most companies are drowning in their data. But then they say, well, geez, with all this data, we should be able to make any decision, right? Well, then you start drilling down to the actual decision. Okay, our current product line is these 5 products. Is that the right size of line? Should we have a line composed of 8, 6, 4? What should those be configured as? Well, if you're having to change what exists in the real world, so for example, a study that was done at Microsoft, they're looking at their hardware line and they have, I'll pull one of their hardware lines that isn't necessarily what was studied. Say keyboards. Say they have 30 keyboards. They've got that funky natural keyboard. They've got a black keyboard. They have the one with the media keys at the top. Anyway, they have like 30 keyboards. Well, it turns out that the optimal size of line for keyboards, for their keyboards, is probably 6. But 2 of them don't exist yet. They're mixes of other keyboards. Well, in order to get at that kind of thing, you have to collect what-if data, usually, on things that don't exist yet. So for any of that kind of thing, we end up collecting data an awful lot of the time. For other problems, for example, marketing mix kinds of problems, where you're trying to decide how much money should I be spending on TV versus radio versus my digital versus Google versus whatever, that's the kind of thing where you have all the sales data and how much you've been spending on everything, and so the data already exists, so we grab all that data and we can run our models and get the answer. Yes?
I have a question. Like, for example, like, do you charge like same prices, or like do you have commissions? Like, depends on the for example, if you have like a thing with like a big business, a big company, do you like you get commission like same with the smaller?
So how much do we charge?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, if we're working with a big company, do we charge a lot more, or do we get a commission, or do we get a part of the lift or anything? So generally, a study kind of costs what it costs. We've done some studies for small companies in Salt Lake. I mean, we don't have a lot of clients in Salt Lake. Fortune 500s don't have headquarters here. But we've done some little studies for smaller companies, and we try to keep the price down. But ultimately, if you have to go out and gather the data and you have to do all the work, you pretty much have to charge about the same amount of money. So generally, we end up charging the same for a small company as for a big company, because that's just how much it costs. And actually, the big companies, they have a lot more power to push those prices down, because they'll go out and get bids from a lot of different competitors, and then they'll really try to push those prices down. So big companies actually tend to get, probably the same prices as small companies. And maybe on that other question is, we would love to work with some companies and tell them, okay, tell you what, we'll do the study for the cost of the data collection, but and we'll just split the lift you get out of implementing the study. But we haven't had anybody ever bite on that one before.
How many competitors are there in this kind of market? Like companies just like you? I mean, how many?
So the top 50 market research firms account for a large part of the business. The top 4 or 5, like AC Nielsen, that's a multi-billion-dollar company, et cetera, are big companies. But as soon as you get down to get into the top 50 companies, you only have to be doing about $12 million a year, and then there are lots and lots and lots of little companies. And the way that those little companies start, this is an entrepreneur kind of a forum, is somebody will usually work for a client. Say you have a job at P&G, and you work on a brand for a while, you're working on Head and Shoulders, and then you say, you know what, I want to start my own company. I'm going to go out, start my own research company, and we're going to work for P&G because we have some real expertise with the Head & Shoulders brand. And so, you come up with some new methodology or whatever, and then you have a small company. It starts off with 1 or 2 or 3 people and ends up with 5 or 10 people, and you're just very, very good at a few things. And so there are a lot of those kind of competitors all over the place. Uh-huh.
Jeff, along those lines, if you saw a small company that you thought had a lot of potential, would you joint venture something and get involved in that company, or is that you're not able to do that as an independent researcher?
So the question is, especially if we were to do some research for somebody and then say, wow, this company has a lot of potential, let's do a joint venture. In general, we're a third-party researcher, and we're not really allowed to do that.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, we'd be in an ethical gray area. For example, if we did a study for Microsoft and we kind of said, hey, they're looking at some really cool new things. Maybe we should be buying Microsoft stock. So that's called insider trading, right?
Okay.
So basically, our ethical standards, we can't do anything that approaches that. Yep.
And then, just to go back to the degrees, I mean, to get into a field like this where it's like analytics and marketing, I mean, what kinds of degrees? Obviously, there's just plain old general marketing degrees, but what kind of field of study would you go into that?
Right, so it depends where you fit in our company. There's a lot of different kinds of people. So for example, for project managers or research managers, they don't have to have a lot of research experience when they start. They have to be smart, and usually they have a degree in some kind of a business degree. It might be a business administration degree, it might be marketing, it might be finance, might be something else. But basically you have to have some knowledge about business. Because what you end up doing is somebody else will give you will do the analyses and give you the results. And then you have to be able to look at it and say, well, what does this mean for the client? What does this mean for the decision maker? What would I do? Would I go fun versus sexy? What would I do? I take all the research, I take all the business knowledge I have and put it together. So a bachelor's degree in any of those things would get people in the door at a junior position. For anything over on the analysis side, they have to have a master's degree in statistics or biostatistics or econometrics or something, because they're the guys that are actually doing the models all day. So they have to know their statistics inside and out. But most people in our company know how to use the statistics, not necessarily how to run the statistics. And then we also have computer programmers that have undergraduate degrees or more in computer programming, and then they're the ones that write the code for the simulations. Okay? Was there one more question back there in the back? I saw your hand up, but I went on to somebody. Okay? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate you coming out, and I'm sure you all do. The thing that you know is I knew that would be a conflict, but I thought we ought to point that out to these students so that as they grow, they're going to be more aware of that kind of a situation. Because as they grow and move in, that will come up, won't it?
Yeah, it will. And I mean, even in a company our size, we have training that everybody has to go through for, say, bribery training. Everybody has to go through. Everybody has to understand it. There's also an ethical code of conduct administered by some of our industry groups that talk about. I mean, for example, we can't do a study if the real reason for the study is actually something to do with sales. So for example, somebody might pretend like they're doing a study, but what they're really doing is they're using somebody to call up, ask you a few questions, and then they're trying to lead you into buying something. Absolutely goes against the ethical standards of our industry, and so we can't do that. And so if a client comes and talks to us about that and tries to push us into, and it becomes obvious to us that that's what they're really doing, We just cut it off and say, no, we're a research company. So there are a whole bunch of different ethical standards that have to be met, and insider trading is certainly one of them that we talk about with all of our people. In spite of the fact, by the way, that a lot of our people say, well, hey, we're working a lot with certain clients. We should buy their stock because they're working with us. And we say, well, it can look bad.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, let's give Jeff a round of applause. I'm sure